Hi, I'm Jack Koenig, and this is an example of a simple G3 and MSP system for a frac pump. This is our block strainer, and I'm going to hit manual run on the pump. And you'll see on the gauge that the gauge isn't moving very much because this filter is new. We're using an NLGI number 1 lithium grease, which is a grease that's pretty easy to pump. But I just wanted to show that even as we're pumping grease through this, it's not really registering on the gauge. If this filter was dirty, like it would be in a filter that had been in service for a while, the gauge pressure would start to rise. So if you're familiar with the normal pressure of your system, and then you start to see the pressure rising over time, it is an indication that it could be time to change your filter. So now let's look at the steps involved in replacing the filter element in this block strainer. Before we service this filter, there's one thing we need to do, and that is relieve pressure at the pump outlet. This main line in between the filter and the pump element is going to have pressure in it. Here, obviously, we don't show any pressure on the gauge, but gauges break. They're not always reliable, so even if your gauge says 0, if you have a dirty filter, you're going to have some pressure trapped upstream. So the easiest way to relieve pressure is just to loosen the fitting at the pump outlet. And there we see the grease is seeping out the bottom. That means that whatever residual pressure is in there is being relieved. This is a very small main line, so there's not a lot of grease compressed inside of it. In a more typical system with a larger main line, you're going to have a lot more grease that comes out there when you crack that fitting open. So once it's relieved the pressure, you can close it again. And now we're ready to take the plug out of the filter body so that we can get access to the filter element and replace it with a new one. Now let's look at the process of removing and replacing the old strainer with a new one. In the real world, you should not need to take your filter body out of service and then put it into a vise like I'm doing here. But because my little demo system was just sitting on the table, I needed to take it out. You normally should just be able to leave it mounted in place and pop this hex off the bottom. The big key is that this needs to be mounted so that the hex is either facing down or horizontal or even an angle like this. Just don't have the hex up on top of the filter, because if the hex is on top, once this hex is removed, it's really a plug that is then going to let the element out, and any contaminants should normally fall out with the old element. If it's up on top, those contaminants are just going to fall back into the filter body, and then they'll still be there when the new filter is put in. Plus, some of them will have then snuck past the area protected by the element, and then they're going to go downstream to the divider valve and cause problems either with the divider valve or with the lube points themselves. So you really want to make sure those contaminants come out with the old element. One other quick note, it's about 34 millimeters across the flats. That's around 1 3/8 of an inch or just under it. So if you happen to have one of those big wrenches in those size, you could use it, but most people are just going to use a crescent wrench set to the right spacing, and there. Here, now we can turn it by hand. There's the plug, and then here is the old element. We can just put the new element inside. It's just going to slide right in there. And if there's enough grease, it'll stay put too. And now the plug can just be reinstalled. And then when we tighten the hex with our wrench, we just need to get it snug. We don't need to be putting a huge amount of pressure on that. There we go. So that's a straight thread with an O-ring seal. All it needs is to be snugged up after it's finger tight. So now the next step will be to, in my case, reinstall it, and then we're going to use the bleed screw on top of the filter to bleed air out of the filter body so that it isn't forced downstream into the rest of the system. So let's do that next. Now that the new element has been installed into the filter body and we have replaced and tightened the plug on the bottom. Let's remove the bleed screw. And now let's run the pump. And here comes the grease. It actually took a few minutes before the grease came up out of the top, and that shows that it's filled the cavity. Sometimes you'll get a bubble of air, so it's okay to let it run a little bit extra and just make sure that you're getting grease and that all the air has been removed. Now we can stop our pump and replace the plug. The plug is also a straight thread with an O-ring seal, so it doesn't need a lot of torque. Just finger tighten it and then give it a little bit of an extra snug, and that's plenty of pressure. And now we're all done replacing the filter element in our block strainer. The process for an oil filter is almost the same, so you could use this as a guide for that as well. Thank you for watching this video, and let us know if you have any questions. And thank you for choosing Graco.